Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this great occasion to be here. For me, as president of European Center for Electoral Support, is also a big element of pride to be here today and to be able also to exchange not only on what a lot of people consider only a technical issue, that is to say electoral assistance, but just to show how far beyond the simple technicalities this question goes to touch very deep issues like the one that the previous speaker just touched. Et sur ça, je voudrais lui dire que plus ou moins en 1870 ou 80, un monsieur qui s'appelait Massimo d'Azeglio a dit: maintenant, on a fait l'Italie, il faut faire les Italiens. Et on n'a pas encore fini. Donc, cette question de la construction des nations par rapport à leurs institutions, c'est vraiment une histoire qui est toujours en marche et que je ne pense pas qu'il peut être définie comme quelque chose de fermé ou défini. And that is why I believe that while I fully agree that there is the need, not only for Africa, but also for the European Union to reconsider in the light of a very unstable peace we are living today, at least in our continent and in part of the world, to review not only its own relations, but also the way in which this issue of democracy and governance is seen in the perspective of economic and social growth and of all the global challenges that we are envisaging. I also believe that in this re-examination, we should not run the risk, and I'm not saying that Mr. Minister was doing it, to relativize the global and the universal value of certain issues like freedom, rights, the right to be governed fairly, the openness and transparency. Because this is not something that is relatively to culture, it is something that is positive from wherever you see it, no matter what culture you have. And this is not at all a kind of Western imposition, because I believe that this is an issue, is a question, but I believe that this strive for liberty and for freedom and for well-being is there for all peoples of the world, but it has to be adapted and it has to be declined in a way that today probably is not properly right. And this is something, just to answer the question of Victoria, that I could also draw from my own experience, which is, of course, much more limited than the one that a lot of people can share here, in relation to the work of electoral observation and assistance. In terms of, because many years ago already, when electoral assistance was not existing among the programs of the European Union, I had the chance of being chief observers in 2 countries, which are not in Africa, but in Latin America. And there, for me, it was extremely clear that without linking the observation to some kind of follow-up, but also stepping up, it was very, very difficult that this kind of observation would be more than just an episode in the relation with a country that probably would forget immediately after what the observation had resulted to. And also the credibility of what the European Union does in terms of observation becomes much more meaningful if the programs of electoral assistance can count on good practitioners, good implementation, but also on a framework that is based on a valuable and effective political dialogue, which is done from the institution of the European Union in cooperation with the member states, because as somebody said, if the donors, or in any case, those who are working around the electoral process are not in agreement with each other, then the possibility of not having a credible system of assistance and observation just makes even more difficult and even weaker the capacity of these instruments to help with the governance of the different countries, and there is an increasing, and there is the risk, which is not only a risk, in some cases it does exist, with a lack of trust of those who are actually fighting for more democracy in those countries to rely, or at least to be able to count on some kind of help and assistance by the international community. And I want to insist on this because I believe that one of the questions that are more difficult for me to tackle is exactly the lack or the decreasing credibility of the action of the European Union, but in general the global community in terms of help for human rights and democracy in different crisis places, not only because there are conflicts, but because, as somebody already said, the concept of democracy itself is weakening. And there is no accident for that. It's not that it is just happening like this. It's because in some places, in some cases also in our countries, democracy does not work. It does not bring the results that are that are expected, and therefore the trust of people diminishes. So I believe that one of the most important elements of a working electoral system is exactly to help democracy work. Of course, I know everybody said it, elections are not the only element that are important in the definition of a democracy. In order to have a thriving democracy and therefore credible elections, you need to have a system of financing that is transparent, that is not giving too much advantage to some in relation to others, that is fair. You need a press that is free. You need all sorts of elements that can concur to make elections work. And in some cases, we were too lenient on the other elements, and therefore the exercise of democracy was disappointing, with very big backlash on the credibility of the whole process. So this is what makes also our work as practitioner of election assistance so interesting and so important beyond the technicalities, because you have to talk with actually and to work for the beneficiaries and with the donors in order to make sure that also those steps are somehow reflected in the result and what you actually do, and also and the credibility of the whole process is actually transparently possible to be judged. And if it is not, and there is why the election observation is so key and why the election observation is so important, it has to be possible to say it. It has to be possible to express clearly this process is not working as it should. And this process should be improved in a way that does not, of course, only depend from the practitioners of electoral assistance and from the program that the European Union, in this case, is presenting, but also from a very committed political dialogue that is there from the part of the European Union and of its member states, because this has been one of the most interesting conclusions that I took from my own experience as both observer and electoral assistant provider, and that is that when this political dialogue is not there, it is much more difficult to implement the recommendations, because we cannot push for constitutional reforms. We cannot push for rules reforms if we don't have the support and if you don't have the framework of a good political dialogue. So just to conclude, I think that we are all participating to this big challenge of making democracy live in the world. But this is not an end in itself. We know that all sorts of policies that have to do with the global challenges like climate, inequalities, poverties, and indeed transparency, need a thriving democracy. It is an illusion to think that authoritarian countries can lead to better welfare and to better economic development. And there are too many people, including in Africa, but increasingly in Europe, who believe that this is the case. And we have, by proving that democracy can work, an election can be fair and transparent, prove the contrary. Thank you.